talk about asset management and why it's broken. Someone asked a good question. Throw that in there.
Cool. Cool. All right, so this talk is about vulnerability remediation, and this talk is about, is this working? Are you doing it?
Raise that up.
Thank you. This talk is about vulnerability management, and this talk in particular is about how to operationalize some of the insights that we gain at Risk.io about vulnerability management. I am not a security professional. I have never remediated a single vulnerability. I've never done a pen test. I've never touched a PCI scorecard, and I don't have a CISP. What I do have is I have a whole bunch of data about vulnerabilities, assets, exploits, and breaches at my disposal. Risk.io aggregates and correlates data from about 20 different scanners. We also get threat intelligence feeds from a bunch of different sources about breaches and exploits. And looking at all this aggregate data, I can mine some insight about what it is that is important and what it is that affects the risk of your environment, and also how to operationalize that risk. This talk is about how to mitigate information security risk operationally and efficiently. So let's start by defining what risk itself is. There are many definitions, but the most encompassing one is pretty simple. It's that more can happen than will. This is a definition by economist Peter Bernstein, and I think that this is especially important for us because as information security professionals, we're forced with a slew of vulnerabilities, with millions of vulnerabilities that we just can't keep up with. Both the disclosure rate and the vulnerabilities that are currently present on systems are more than we can possibly account for. So what I want to do is I want to reduce that risk, and keep in mind that when I say reduce, I don't mean eliminate. From a data-driven perspective, eliminating risk is essentially impossible for two reasons. The first is that the data can't capture all the things that can happen, both in the sense that past information about events can't capture all the information about future events, and in the sense that our data is just not robust enough to capture all of the possible outcomes. Second is that your organization is constantly changing, and it's a complex system, meaning the risks it is exposed to currently or at the time of a particular assessment are constantly changing as well. It means that when we make sure that of the things that can happen, the least desirable ones won't happen to us, should be the focus of our risk management programs. So let's keep that in mind while we take a look at ways that people track remediation and perform remediations. There are a whole bunch of bad remediation metrics, and I think that sadly most of them are pretty commonplace. The most common one that I see is vulnerability density, and density just doesn't work. So we have a data set of about 1 million currently active assets at Risk.io, and when I look at those, they start out with around 82 vulnerabilities, and currently they have, of the active assets that we have right now, the average is about 70 vulnerabilities of those that have assets. And that tells me absolutely nothing. How many vulnerabilities came out in the time frame from when the asset was imported into our database to the time the remediation took place? Of the 12 per asset that were fixed, did they actually reduce risk? Did they matter? Were they CVSS 1 or CVSS 10? Does that actually indicate any type of risk? Of the 70 that remain, is the risk actually reduced at all? Have you remediated vulnerabilities and have left ones that still contribute or create the same types of risks as the previous ones? The metric actually begs the question of what risk is and how to measure risk. The second one is CVSS score reduction. I think this is what most metrics programs are based on, whether it's through a scanner or whether it's through the actual operational program. Reducing the overall CVSS score, the average CVSS score on an asset, is another approach. And this is a whole other talk that I gave previously, but I want to sum it up really quickly in that that approach also doesn't work. And the reason is pretty data-driven as well. So part one of this talk is fix what matters. We're going to identify the factors that are crucial to identifying risks in your environments. And then part two will be how we operationalize that risk. Because just knowing what it is that exposes you to risk is not enough. It is important to operationalize that so the teams can remediate it, to track that, and to be able to compare it across various asset groups. So let's start. We've got about 50 million live vulnerabilities across 1.5 million assets, and that's about 2,000 different organizations. And by live vulnerabilities, I mean instances of vulnerabilities on specific assets that are currently unclosed and the business is exposed to. From a separate data set, I have about 3 million breach events. And breach events here mean the type of thing that the Verizon DBIR terms incidents. That is, a machine had an open vulnerability on it, and there's some kind of indicator of compromise at the same time that the vulnerability was open on the system, or an exploit was fired off at that system at the same time, which means that the exploit was successful, the attack was successful, but it might not have actually gotten any data out of it because it might have been, just a hosted PDF file somewhere with no data in it, or it might have been step 2 of a 5-chain vulnerability process. Regardless, knowing that the attack was successful and that it got through and that the vulnerability was open when it launched lets us train a certain probability of how successful different types of attacks are. So, when we correlate these 3 million breaches to the 50 million vulnerabilities that we have across our database, what we see is pretty simple. If you take a random vulnerability in NVD and you remediate that vulnerability, the probability that you have remediated a vulnerability that has a live breach event associated with it is about 2%. So that's our baseline. That's what we're shooting the dartboard against. If you just throw a random dart at a vulnerability, 2% chance that it's one that actually matters and one that is actually preventing a breach event. If you compare that to CVSS itself and break it down by scores, if you pick a random CVSS 10 vulnerability, that probability of fixing something that has a live breach event associated with it goes up to 3.5%. So you might think that this is pretty good. It's almost 100% better. But it's still, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty small percentage, a small predictive value positive of what it means to be successful in your remediation practice. If you look at CVSS 9, that score drops down very quickly. If you look at CVSS 9.5 and above, I think it's actually above 2%. And if you start looking below, it very quickly drops out to less than just randomly picking a vulnerability. So this shows you that essentially what CVSS tells you is if it's a 10, there's some chance that you're doing better than random by remediating those vulnerabilities. If it's any less than a 10, you're probably, the granularity in the score is not very useful. And later in the talk, we'll get into all the reasons as to why this particular type of model or this particular type of prediction about what it is that you should be fixing is not very useful. So, similarly, I don't want to just tell you that CVSS sucks, I want to tell you how you can do better than that. And there are a bunch of factors that we found that are pretty good at predicting live breach events, and they're pretty intuitive. The first is, if the vulnerability has an exploit, has an entry in exploit DB, and you randomly remediate one of those vulnerabilities, the probability that it has a live breach event on it is about 12.5%. That's pretty good. If you look at Metasploit, you're up to about 25%. And if you look at the intersection of the two, that is, there's a Metasploit module available for that vulnerability, as well as some code in exploit DB, you're looking at about a 28% chance of remediating a vulnerability that has a breach associated with it. So the reason that's intuitive is because this is the easiest way to attack an enterprise, right? Metasploit modules can be automated. These things are probably launched in high volume and probably without being very targeted. So this is one factor, and this is something I want to drive home, that this is one factor that contributes to the risk of assessing a vulnerability. And the takeaway from this is pretty simple. It tells you a prescription of one of the factors that's important. The proper way to use this in your enterprise is not so clear. So to stop focusing on vulnerabilities and purely prioritize them on their CVSS score is easy to tell you. However, the proper way to operationalize this information is what this talk is about. So part one is essentially just setup. I wanted to tell you that current ways of tracking vulnerabilities, of tracking remediation, whether it's through vulnerability density, whether it's through some kind of segmentation by business unit and then looking at CVSS, is not actually that efficient at capturing risk or at stopping live breach events. So let's talk about the reasons why it's not. What we currently have is a disparate number of business processes or information about the assets in your environment. So you might have information from the business about how important uptime is, defined by what process is running on this group of assets. You might have information about how sensitive data is in a particular server. You might have some technical information, like is this asset within my DMZ or is it 7 layers deep in the stack? And this is all important. This is information that's important for you to prioritize what you should be fixing first. But it's disparate. It's really hard to aggregate. Some of it is defined by a business process. Some of it is defined by something very technical like a DMZ. Some of it might be defined by what type of technology is running on that particular asset. And what's important in being able to compare, analyze, and track the risk reduction in your environment is being able to compare all of these disparate frameworks, processes, and data. So just attempting to compare them to each other, you end up with a very ordinal scale. And this is a problem that's been talked about by many people like Bob Rudis, Jay Jacobs, and Dan Geer. And the particular quote that I want to pull for this case is from Dan Geer. He says that our present scale of measurement in security, we generally have an ordinal scale at best, not an interval and certainly not a ratio scale. So in plain terms, this means that we can say that X is doing better than Y, but how much better and compared to what is something that we can't really capture about our environment. Take a look at the Netflix ratings. So let's say, you watch 2 one-star movies, and they're both pretty terrible, and you watch 1 2-star movie. The 1 2-star movie is probably preferable, but summing up 2 one-star movies doesn't get you to the same place. And this is kind of what we're doing by aggregating CVSS scores, or by summing up, let's say, the average CVSS score of the 70 vulnerabilities in a particular asset. This is the simpler way of saying it, right? The business process that is affected by a group of vulnerabilities is not captured. So impact might be happening to an entire business process, but we say that this vulnerability has a certain measure of impact, and this vulnerability has a certain measure of likelihood. Let's add them all up, and let's see what that tells us and track it over time. That's not reflexive of the actual state of things. And this is where we want to be. We want to use a bunch of different data that we have, and that data might be the business process stuff that we talked about earlier that I'm trying to discount. It might even be CVSS that I'm trying to discount. But we want to build that into a framework that allows us to operationalize and track that particular risk. So this is where we want to go. We want to build a model for measuring how well our remediation practice is working. And by working, I mean reducing risk. And this framework needs to be repeatable. That is, once we introduce new data to the framework, we should still be able to compare our current state of affairs as more data is piping in to our previous state of affairs. So I have a bunch of data at Risk.io. I have the breach data, I have the exploit data. I want to show you how I can build a practice like that and how I can track groups of assets. And then we can talk about how the things that are specific to your environments can be integrated into this type of model. So the data that I have to work with is pretty simple. I have data about whether a vulnerability is actively being breached right now. I have data about whether that vulnerability has a Metasploit module, has an entry in exploit DB, and is a popular target. I say popular target because we've got about 50 million live vulnerabilities and constantly getting more. And taking a look at which ones of those are recently trending or having a spike in velocity lets us know that, let's say, this new vulnerability that came out in the last MS Patch Tuesday is not that important because it doesn't actually exist in live assets, whereas this one is spiking even though it was released 2 years ago. So I want to open up the floor and let's chat about it now. This is a pretty simplistic data set that tells you things about the likelihood of exploit. What other types of data would you include in an assessment of the risk to your particular environment? And floor is open to anybody who wants to throw something out.
Can you repeat the question?
So this is data about live vulnerabilities and about assessing the likelihood of breach to a particular live vulnerability. What other type of data in your environments that I don't see from getting a bunch of aggregate data would you use in that assessment?
Exploit kits for client-side exploitation, black hole, crime pack, those sort of things.
Okay, and where do you think those would slot in between the 4 of these?
They're I guess, the black hat side of that exploit. It's if it is weaponized is kind of the word that we offer.
Okay, so it's like Metasploit plus plus. This is more important than Metasploit, and we want to gather data about which vulnerabilities that impacts. Right?
Because those are very spiky. There's like, at any given month, there's one that's populated, there's one that's being used actively.
Yep, that definitely makes sense.
You don't have insight into what I consider critical assets.
So I don't, right, because this is what you consider critical assets. But I agree with you, and this is something that I was wanting somebody to say. Your business priority should be one of these data points, right? Like maybe you have incredibly sensitive information that vulnerability affects the particular asset that it's sitting on. That is another piece of information that you want to throw into this type of model.
Mitigating controls.
Right. So maybe you don't really care if it's a popular target if that asset is completely insulated from absolutely everything, and that can override all of these data points for you. But the point is that I want to use the data that I have available to illustrate how to build a model, and I think that all of the data sources mentioned now, especially Black Hat exploit kits, I think that's something that should be included in this, how that can be operationalized and used to create an interval scale instead of just a comparative ordinal scale. So there's been a lot of good work done about how to aggregate ground truth metrics. Specifically, Mr. meritology on Twitter is Russell Thomas, has published the Thomas scoring system, which is a way to use a whole bunch of different metrics, whether they are, CVSS scores or probabilities or truth falsity metrics, and how to aggregate those into a specific framework. The way that I do it is kind of like what his framework does. But what's important here is that regardless of the precision of the data that you have, you want to include it all into building this type of framework. And moreover, the data that you have coming into the framework changes often. So maybe you have new data sources coming in, maybe you have more granularity in the data. The framework should account for those things. So in our case of reducing risk to groups of assets, these are the two insights that I want to carry into the framework as I build the model. The first is we want to estimate the likelihood of a breach event for each vulnerability. And the reason for this is twofold. Why just likelihood? Why not likelihood times impact? That's because impact is rarely a measure of a single vulnerability or an asset. Instead, impact is a measure of a business process or a set of data, and that might be characterized by an asset grouping. It might not even be characterizable by an asset grouping because it might be something outside of what your data is capturing. But the likelihood of that thing being breached is always an important factor in assessing the criticality of that risk. The second reason that likelihood is particularly important is because likelihood is one of the only things that we can say about a specific vulnerability on a specific asset. We can say that contextually because of the way in which where this asset is placed and what this vulnerability is and what data we know about that vulnerability, this is the probability that we will get breached. This is a prediction of what the chances of us getting exploited on that vulnerability is. When we talk about impact, maybe in the CVSS sense, like we say, hard bleed is only information disclosure, we're insulating that impact to a specific instance of a vulnerability, which is not actually descriptive of the impact that is happening system-wide. So with hard bleed, if we say it's only information disclosure, yeah, it's a CVSS 5 vulnerability because it's only information disclosure in that instance. However, the reason that score sucks and doesn't actually tell us how bad hard bleed is because the impact is system-wide. You might lose credentials for the entirety of the system, and that's not something that type of assessment addresses. So my framework will look at only likelihood estimates. The second piece of my framework is a philosophical choice. It's that an asset is only as safe as the riskiest vulnerability on that particular asset. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is that this kind of describes the real world, the state of the real world, is that remediation has a diminishing return. So you might remediate the top 5 most riskiest vulnerabilities of the 1,000 vulnerabilities that existed on an asset, but if you go deeper down the stack, you might not be reducing your risk level enough. It might be enough to get you out of the red, out of the most severe and most critical ones that are currently being breached or included in black kit exploit kits. But if you remediate the next 200 vulnerabilities on that asset, you're not really changing the landscape of how vulnerable that asset is. It still has 5 or 6 different chains contained in it. Those vulnerabilities are not that severe or don't have a high probability of being exploited. The second point that I want to drive home here about why this is important is because risks, and this is the entire point of the framework, is that the risks that a particular vulnerability and a particular asset quantifies do not exist in a vacuum, nor are they independent. The assumptions that we make when giving them scores or when just counting them up and summing them up is that these vulnerabilities exist in a vacuum and we can sum them up. However, they impact business processes. They impact groups of assets. They don't impact individual assets. And moreover, they're interdependent. A pen tester in the audience might say, so you're ranking this asset a 10 because it has one really risky vulnerability on it, but I see a 3, a 4, and a 5 that I can chain together and really own you and get shell access. What I say to that is that upper bounding it by the riskiest vulnerability actually gives you a sense of how at risk that asset is. So while there might be a bunch of other disparate pathways through the less risky vulnerabilities to cause impact or harm to the asset, the way that we quantify it or the way that we assess the risk is we err on the side of caution, and we say that the riskiest one is the way that we assess risk to that asset. So this is certainly a philosophical choice. I think it's one that reflects the interconnectedness between those risks, and I think it's one that upper bounds the interconnectedness between those risks. So using those two things, I want to build a model. And I think that model needs to do 2 things. New data types need to be able to be added to the model without changing the output of the model. So 10 years ago, we didn't have seam logs that were that good. We couldn't mine them for indicators of exploits. I think we should be able to compare things 10 years ago to things today. I think we should be able to compare current assessments or current ways of assessing risks to the ways in which we'll be able to do it in 5 years when new data sources come in. And the second is that the output of this model, for us to really be able to track risk reduction, needs to be comparable between different asset groups. And this will become apparent when I talk about the types of asset groups, but as I've said before, there are technological asset groups, there are business process asset groups, and then there are asset groups that are based on, who's responsible for that domain or who's responsible for these assets. And while they're all machines or they're all servers or they're all IPs, the way in which impact or risk is calculated to these assets needs to be different, but needs to be comparable. So here's the model that I'm going to build out of just the 4 factors that I have. I contend that something that is actively breached is probably more at risk than something that has a Metasploit module, but that is more at risk than an exploit DB module and more at risk than just a popular target. If anybody has questions, we can talk about that, but I think that this is pretty intuitive. So I'm ranking the order, right? And this is something that I just told you shouldn't do, but to start with, I'm ranking the order of what's important. And the things that we talked about, and why I asked where does a black hat exploit kit slot in, it probably slots in somewhere above Metasploit and somewhere below the actively breached vulnerability. What is your the criticality to your business slot in, or the sensitivity of the data slot in? I think that depends largely on a business-by-business basis, but I would contend that it probably falls below the actively breached vulnerabilities. So this model is not much different than the things that I'm criticizing. Let's turn this ordinal scale into a ratio scale. So a particular vulnerability has 16 possible outcomes in this, right? Yes, no for each one of these 4 factors, multiply them through. So it can be actively breached and have none of the other characteristics. Then it can be actively breached, have a Metasploit module, and have none of the other characteristics, and so on and so forth. You can build a bit-signed inventory of these 16, like has all of them but 1, and so on. And then divide whatever scale you want. I'm going to use a 1 to 10 scale into the 16 parts that this type of data allows you to use. So the reason this is scalable is one can imagine adding in black hat exploit kits, and now all of a sudden you've got 32 possible options for what to do, and it fits onto that same interval scale and is once again comparable in terms of risk against the previous 4 factors that we had before. And in practice at Risk.io, we actually use 7 different factors, some of which are not, true, false, some of which are not yes or no, but they can still slot into this by saying, something can be actively breached plus be ranked one of these things on the scale or have a probability of this much. And we can look at all the possible intersections, map them onto that interval scale. So here the worst vulnerability would be a 10. Something that's actively breached has a Metasploit and an exploit DB but is not a popular target would be a 9.375. And I want to take a look at why this is actually better. So this is not just the 4 scales. This is what all of the things that we actually use. We smooth CVSS to be predictive value of the actual breaches that are happening. We add in asset priority, as you said. We take a look at all of those 4 factors, and we take a look at whether the asset is external or internal as well. But the score that we create does significantly better than CVSS, and I think visually it's easily seen that this is a more or less a normal distribution, or this is a statistically significant distribution that you can use to make some assumptions about the standard deviations of particular vulnerabilities. What you're looking at right now is all of the 62,000 vulnerabilities in NVD on the on your right-hand side, ranked by their CVSS scores, and you can see the craziness of that distribution. And then on the left-hand side, ranked by this type of interval scale and scaled across the data that we collect about these. And keep in mind that this distribution more or less changes daily for us as new vulnerabilities come out, as new exploits come out, as things become popular targets or all of a sudden drop down in the rankings. This changes, but the distribution more or less looks the same. It has a couple of thousand vulnerabilities that are extremely important, and a whole bunch of other ones that are not so important, centered around like a 4. This is useful in 2 senses. There's a statistical significance in which you can look at the distribution of risks that account for it. This actually looks like a loss function in engineering, where only a few of the things a few of the risks that you're exposed to are responsible for most of your breaches or for the most important things. And second, there's a fundamental difference between creating a model that is based on the data that you gather about breach events or the data that you gather about vulnerabilities, and creating a model that seeks to predict the future. So CVSS does exactly that. It gives you a score that says how likely is it to be exploited and what's the value of the impact once it does get exploited. It tries to tell you, this is a 10. You got to fix it now because in the future this was a big problem for you. That is not what this distribution is doing. this distribution is measuring all the past events and updating that information as it comes in. And in doing so, because we're not trying to predict something that is very difficult to predict, we are only saying this is what the snapshot of the past looks like. If we want to make an assessment about something new that comes in, we can compare it to that snapshot of the past and then assess that this is critical. Thankfully, most of the vulnerabilities that we encounter when we do assessments are not actually, will either do slot into this or follow some kind of pattern defined in the past data that we see, or they're just instances of the 62,000 that are currently already scored according to this algorithm. And so we can easily slot them in and say, this one's extremely important. It has all of the characteristics that we have seen be responsible or be indicators of attacks in the past. So that's on a vulnerability. That's on an individual risk level. But I've talked extensively about how the individual risk level is not reflective of the actual business risk or the actual risk to assets. So let's talk about how this type of model translates to asset-based remediation tracking. So say you've got one asset and you've got 6 vulnerabilities on that particular asset. They have a bunch of different factors. The ones in yellow are yeses, the ones in white are no. Using the 2 types of remediation tracking practices that I talked about, you might say, it's got 6 vulnerabilities on it. In the past month, we've remediated 2. We're doing a lot better. But my contention is that if you're not remediating the one that has all of the critical factors that you see are indicators of likelihood of breach, you're not actually reducing the risk at all. So to reduce the risk or to remediate the risk on those particular asset groups, what you want to do, you want to remediate the one vulnerability that has the most indicators of it. And this extends very, very logically to groups of assets, right? So now we've got 3 assets. They also have the same vulnerabilities across them. If you've got 3 assets and you've reduced your average vulnerability count to 1, you might not have done anything because the middle asset still has the one that is going to be the responsible for the breach event. So using the previous scoring that we did, we can take a look at this group of assets and we can say, on each one of these assets, the risk to that asset is defined by the riskiest vulnerability on it. And across this asset group, there's one particular asset which has an extremely risky vulnerability on it. So this is a point of contention, I think, where a lot of people would say, but the other vulnerabilities across these asset groups can be chained together, and a pen tester would say, I could go after, the one that's only a popular target and the exploit DB one, and chain them together to create an even bigger risk. But I would say that that risk is upper bounded by the fact that we've already characterized an asset as being as risky as possible. So maybe there's an externality that exists that's generating more risk that I can't account for. I'm upper bounding that by saying that only the riskiest thing that contributes to our environment's risk. So what does this type of modeling do for you, and why is this something that you should be doing? So you can see statistically why it's better than something like a CVSS assessment on an individual level, but you can also see how you can create disparate asset groups inside the business and use those to track remediation. So what I mean is, now we are comparing all of a sudden risks to risks instead of apples to oranges. So say you had a technology group that's your Linux runtime environment, and you've got 1,000 assets in that group that are assessed based on this, based on the riskiest vulnerability in each one of those assets, and that gets a score of, whatever, 8, or in this case, 800. And you want to compare that to your PCI asset group, or you want to compare that to the assets that Ed Bellis is responsible for. And that might be 500 assets that are disparate machines of different kinds. Some of them might not even be machines. How do you do that in a vulnerability count sense? There's absolutely no way to do that. In this sense, you've got a quantification of the risk to each asset. You can average out across the asset group. And if you want to reduce that risk, then you're reducing the thing that is most likely to contribute to your risk, and you can track it over time. So at Risk.io, we actually let our clients do this, and I mined out some of the really common things that people are assigning asset groups to. And I think that this is, when looking at this data, it's pretty intuitive to you what you see. So people, yes, are addressing their PCI assets. Yes, Windows 7 is less risky than Windows XP, maybe as a function of there being less vulnerabilities, maybe as a function of the people that are running it are better at remediating them. And yes, Ubuntu is probably better than the average Linux systems, the average Linux assets all across it. But that's not what's important here. What's important here is that by using this interval scale, we have actually put a business process next to a technology group, next to whatever you want to put on that scale, and are able to compare a snapshot of the risk that that group of assets, whether it's a technology or whether it's a business process, is causing to your organization. The tertiary benefit of using this type of system is that not only is this a snapshot, this is not just a picture of the risk in your environment, but it also drives a very different type of remediation practice. It drives one that has internalized into it a measured sense of the risk or risk reduction that you want to be doing. Because in defining this model, we've defined the factors that contribute to risk and defined the factors that we want to be reducing across our asset groups. And in tracking it over time, we can track two things. We can track the reduction of risk that is happening across our asset groups over time, but we can also track the performance of particular security teams. So say you've got a Windows group and a Linux group. To say that the Windows group has closed 30 vulnerabilities in the past week, but the Linux one has closed 10, tells you absolutely nothing about how much risk each one has reduced. Maybe Patch Tuesday was really terrible. Maybe those vulnerabilities were easier to close. What's more important is to see how much the factors that contribute to the actual risk that you have identified are being addressed by those groups. And in creating this type of model, you're forcing these individuals to reduce risk and to address the vulnerabilities that are actually contributing to those factors. The second point I want to drive home is that the state of security changes very, very quickly. If you use assessments like point-in-time snapshots of vulnerability counts or CVSS scores, they lag behind what's actually happening because of attackers. New exploit kits might be released. As you said about black hat exploit kits, they trend every other day or trend every other week. And that is important in being able to understand where the risk is coming from and how that risk is shaping a particular group of assets. If you don't do that, if those are not inputs into the model that you have for remediation, then then the thing that will cause the breach event is ultimately a thing that your models aren't capturing. And so I think it's important to identify those particular factors that contribute to the likelihood of risk. And in order to be able to compare them across disparate asset groups, not only allows you to have a snapshot view, but also allows you to have a view of performance about how you address actual real-time risk. I blazed through that. But we can now talk about models, and we can now talk about how things that you do at your organizations slot into this particular model.
So, you mentioned the 3 million vulnerabilities that you have. When I look at the Horizon Beaver, I used to have 110 pages of talking to these different areas. Is that information available publicly? Like, will I be able to get the 3 million and be able to get the CVEs?
So we have a open source tool called RiskDB, or free tool called RiskDB. You can log in and take a look at what we think that the risk that particular technologies are causing. So say you're running like Jerry 6.02 or Windows XP SP2. You can take a look at whether that has active internet breaches associated with it, easily like this model that I just described. And you can just look them all up one by one and see what we think the risk sort of that is. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah. But again, I think that this is also scalable down to an individual business, right? You have, I don't know, 1 million vulnerabilities sitting across 2,000 assets. You can build the exact same model pretty easily by taking a look at which of those vulnerabilities have correlated to Metasploit, have correlated to ExploitDB, have correlated to business process risk factors that I can't say anything about, but you have a lot more knowledge about, and build in the same type of hierarchical interval system that allows you to compare those asset groups or those risks to each other.
In my organization, we use Nessus, or just call it out, right? So we get you get a little checkmark box. Is it available in Metasploit? Is it available in whatever? So that covers that aspect. I do asset management, so you keep track of these are my critical systems, these are not. And the piece that's missing seems to be, is it actively exploited or not? So I go through like that.
Right.
So that's part of the risk DB, though, as well as actively.
So that's a part of the information that we pull from threat intelligence, and we correlate to assets. I think so. My question to you, I guess, is like, so you have this information about business criticality of those assets. You have whether it's being exploited in Metasploit or not. How do you use that to compare what I'm talking about, like a PCI group to a Windows group?
So when we look through the groups, we go through with the same kind of generalization, right? All these 7 assets are vulnerable to this, and we have assets that are highly critical. We might as well touch all 7 at the same time. Okay, we open up a capabilities there. More of a manual process, but we trying to evaluate it in a lot of the same way. You know, is an exploit available? Is it a really critical vulnerability? Is this something that I can see somebody actually getting involved with? So it's more intuition and less metrics on the.
That makes sense. But yeah, if you want the data, we have it, I suppose. Anyone else? Questions? I guess.
So, sorry, I had to step out for a minute. Do you also consider the placement within the network, the placement within an enterprise, as a factor of risk, or would that just have more of a factor with priority in getting things remediated?
So, personally, we use whether the asset is external facing or internal facing. But I think that there's much more granularity to that than we can offer. You know, people buy entire products just to be able to assess that. Yeah, I think that factors into business provider priority that as a SaaS is very hard to measure. And so you can tell me that priority. But I also think that that can be a factor in building this type of model out, right? So maybe actively exploited 4 levels behind the DMC doesn't actually matter. So we boost or boost down things that are external or versus internal. But we don't ever say that an asset has 0 risk, and the reason for that is our data can't capture all the risks to it, and like even if it has no vulnerabilities on it, you can still get DDoSed on it.
One conversation I'm often having with clients is their question is, clearly this is a problem. Do we need to wake someone up? Can it wait till tomorrow or 2 days from now? Can it wait sometime in the next 10 days or the next regular patch cycle? The question for them is, you know, we have a window of vulnerability. When do we need to close that? Do you guys have metrics on how often after either O-Day or after patch the exploitations tend to happen? Do you have any numbers on that?
Yeah, so we can mine those numbers certainly out. I can tell you from just looking at the data myself, we got Heartbleed breaches happening about 10 hours after disclosure.
I think Heartbleed is
Yeah.
really special, so that's like really anomaly.
But yeah, so it was really special, but I think that the fact that we're tracking it right after it happens means that the data as it's coming in about the breach events, or rather the incident events, is robust enough to capture that type of information. I think...
How about like patch 2 stuff? I guess is maybe a pretty
Right.
typical type of thing.
So we haven't looked at that. It's certainly data that we do have and we can't look at. I would say that in terms of it, so bubbling that information up to, say, like the C level or the management level, I think that building out this type of scoring mechanism is something that they can easily understand. And so when Patch Tuesday comes out, they ask that question because it's precisely for the reason that ordinal scales suck. It's because they can't compare to the ground, to the baseline of what's been happening over time, right? So say they've got, I don't know, 2,000 vulnerabilities in a bunch of Windows assets. Patch Tuesday comes out, they're at 2.2 thousand. What does that mean? Is that important? Should we start remediating these? I think if you explain it in terms of risk and say that as a result of this one particular one that came out that's being actively exploited, has many Metasploit modules, you're now looking at a 750 rather than a 600. That's something that drives action from the upper levels down. And I think that a lot of the reason that you don't get it going bottom up is because it's hard to communicate the comparison between those asset groups to people and the comparison between those risks. Alex?
It's not actually a question, just a follow-up to his question. The fact is, if you actually do an analysis of the ratio of when a vulnerability was released and actually there was a Roytman exploit to it, if you do this over time, for the past few years, this has been reduced dramatically. So every time there's like a Patch Tuesday or something like that, or an Oracle critical event, indeed, they will do like order. I mean, people in the know, they will go in, okay, this looks like an RCE or something that could really profit me in some sense. And it's usually a matter of hours until people say, yeah, that's something that kind of works. You just refer something to the passion people. So it's been getting worse and worse and worse. And it's pretty much a losing battle as far as trying to catch everything before you have an exploit on. But in the end, what I believe is that it's pretty much a numbers game. Like what Michael was saying, is that okay, can I keep the numbers low enough that as the new things come along, and I can prioritize the things that will likely be more exploitable in a way? But I'm not quite sure we're quite there in the predictive stage of where, okay, if there's an RCE, there's like a 3 times more likelihood that this guy would have an exploit sooner than, I don't know, an information disclosure thing or anything like that. I mean, Heartbeat is proved was all wrong. It was just information disclosure, and everybody was at it immediately. So, I guess it is a hard question. It is a hard question to ask for anyone, and we should just try to. I mean, if that's up to date,
Yeah.
Basically, it's a rule of thumb. Like, what is it? I have traditionally said it was 2 weeks. Now it's less than 10 days. He's saying he's really observed hours. We think Heartbeat was minutes to hours.
Yeah.
And so I think to have something in the back of your head when sea levels inevitably say, you know, how soon do we need to get this patched? Any general observations, we as a defensive community are desperate for those. So if you guys got the data, we'd love to see any generalization
That's fair.
you guys got.
I have 2 things to say about that. So the 4 things that I use to build this kind of like small scale model in this talk, I think they're the stages that goes through, right? First, the target is popular, and it is something that's attractive to attackers. Then there's an exploit module, exploit DB entry. Then there's a Metasploit module, maybe a Black Kit module, and then there are active internet breaches. So the time frame between those might be instantaneous. Like when the active breach happens, all of those could have occurred, but our data collection efforts are not. And our data collection efforts are staggered such that first we can identify what's popular, and then it might take some time for us to get to the breach. So yes, Heartbeat probably took negative minutes, right? But until we actually started logging those breach events was a different time frame. And I think that is indicative of, I don't want to say how useless those metrics are, but how wrong they often are, how much they lag behind the reality of the matter. And when looking at those, if you adopt the mentality that, like, this is a pattern that, you know, future things could follow, and I could predict that because this vulnerability came out, it'll have an exploit, I think in reality, when you look at a lot of organizations, they already have those things in the past. So, and they can't fix all, right? So, yes, it is probably true that we can predict that within 2 days, a new vulnerability will have a Black Kit exploit kit. But it is also probably true that you have 10,000 vulnerabilities that already have them, so fix those first.
Have you done any checking in terms of or analysis for user land type exploits versus ones that would be more relevant to servers as part of this? So, like the canonical example would be like IE vulnerability on a server.
Right.
Really sort of browsing the web theoretically on a server.
Yeah, so we haven't segmented, but the data that we get, so the data that we get comes from about 30,000 different businesses, and it logs both anything down from a individual laptop in that organization to a server. So when I look at this in the aggregate, both of those are included. I think the segmentation difference might be less important because most of the data that we're getting is coming from massive volumes of automated attacks in the millions. So whether that server is running IE or not, it's getting hit with an IE exploit. Whether that computer is running a DB or not, it's getting hit with that DB exploit. I think the targeted attack. So we see targeted attacks. We see, like, in this 3-hour bucket, we saw 1 instance of this vulnerability exploit being successful. But as an organization, when you look at the ones that have 200,000 happening in the past hour, I think that becomes less and less of an interesting point, whether there's a targeted attack happening or not against that machine.
Yeah, because I'm just saying, like, a lot of organizations spend a lot more time and headache trying to patch servers because they have to deal with maintenance windows and rebooting and stuff versus workstations where they may be used to, like, patch these days.
So I had a conversation with a couple of our clients about this, and one of the factors that could go into such a model that I think should be going into such a model that I have no idea how to quantify is if I take this server down to patch it, what's the downtime cost me? And that's a conversation that you have with your business units. That's something that you can understand what the cost of that remediation is and factor that into the model. So yes, maybe this is an incredibly terrible vulnerability, but taking it down takes out all of our point-of-sale systems. That can be factored into that model and stratified in the same interval setting, where you can say that it is now a 6 rather than a 9 because it will cost me millions of dollars to take it down.
Okay, conversely, if it's, again, one of those things like it's a browser vulnerability on the server, it's less likely to be exploited than, say, a browser vulnerability on a workstation. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true, but that's can be captured by the mitigating controls argument, right? So I think that is a form of control, and that form of control is just physical infrastructure. So this model of 4 variables is like, it's fairly efficient at capturing exploitation, but it's also a really shitty model. It has 4 variables in it. In reality, it should have about 20. And I think that determining whether something like, a control based on a firewall or a control based on the type of thing that it is a different variable, largely depends on the scale of your organization, whether you can attribute time to operationalizing that data feed. That's not something that a scanner will tell you, but if you can quantify that, that's great.
So you said model based on 4 variables, ideally it would be 20 or something where you get more precise with the calculations. So could you rely on your clients to supply that data to calculate that?
I would like to say yes. So we actually we factor in asset priority into our models that we build. So when I showed you that here, this like textual analysis of how they group things. So yeah, like maybe somebody lied that that's a PCI asset, or maybe it's like the Linux tags are probably automated Qualys tags that are coming out. But I think that, data in, data out, it's important to see how they segment those assets. And then if somebody ranks something a priority, it is an important question that we are also always trying to answer better, of like how you score that particular priority. Is it a 1 to 10 scale? Is this important or not? I think that's depending on the type of business you're in, that's a conversation that you can have with a client, or that's a model that you need to build in that's just repeatable across clients. But yeah, of course rely on it, because then it's their fault if it goes wrong.
Well, it would be, from my standpoint, it would be like, if I can say, oh, well, I know my infrastructure, so I know my assets, which ones are critical, I know which ones go with which business unit, and then somehow assign like a weight to it, or like add that to your model, make your model wider, so you can calculate it more precisely.
So I would warn you from making that model wider. I think you're saying 2 things there. I think the first thing that you're saying is that you know the criticality of business assets. So there are 2 types of criticality. There's the criticality that can slot in an impact or likelihood sense into this type of tiered model for a particular vulnerability, particular assets. There's also the type of criticality that says this group of assets is critical. And I think when you segment across those groups, even if they're overlapping, this type of thing where you say you tag 1,000 assets as a business process that's critical, and then look at its risk relative to other processes, is fine. You can say that both of these are at 800, but I know that this is the critical business group. I'm going to look at this one first. And that's my goal here is to always compare the risk to the risk. And if you are conflating that risk model by saying that I believe that this is more important, not the data says it's more important, you want to stray away from that assessment at all times. That said, if your client comes back and says, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 most important groups, and you come back and say all of them are ranked, a 50 out of 100 on my risk model that I built, that's totally fine. That means they've already made the decision themselves as to what to go after first.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah.
I mean, what it seems to me is that whatever data comes from the customer is much more cost of fixing the vulnerability like that. So if you conflate the risk with the cost, right, it actually makes sense. So, for example, let's say you have all this vulnerability there, and you know that, for instance, last vulnerability, right? And it was 4, 4, 5, right? Was the SMB. So you know that if you had a relatively good model protection around it, you would get hit by an outcome, right? But if you something for 80 like that, like a Joomla vulnerability or WordPress vulnerability, it has to have this model, right? The actual additional measures that you have to have be much greater. Right? You need to have an IPS, or you need to have a lab in the environment in order to be able to actually protect against this kind of. So it becomes difficult to measure where does the risk, the actual risk ends, this in my opinion, and where is the actual, okay, how much does it cost the business or the end customer to catch this, right? So that has to go out and buy a new app, I may be completely wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's really in line with what I'm saying. I think the things that you can concretely measure and the things that you have constant streaming or non-streaming data about are the things that should go into these models. And then those types of subjective client assessments, and whether they're subjective or not is really irrelevant, can be applied to the output of these models. In which case, so this is the point, right? They need to be repeatable and they need to be comparable over time. And if those situations change over time in a way that is subjective to who's running the ship at that point, I don't want that to be in the model.
So I think part of the challenge with the asset classification model you talked about is, like, yeah, you have your PCI servers, but many organizations, those are like one hop away from a server that's low criticality. So if you get your low criticality server, we do some pen tests all the time, do mini cats on it, grab the admin credentials, your domain admin, jump to PCI zone, and
I agree. And so when we look at something like this, where the PCI is like scoring lower in a relative sense to a bunch of the other assets, when I'm looking at this kind of graph, and if you tell me that my PCI assets are at 400, but my Windows 7 are at 800, I'm not spending additional resources fixing PCI assets. I'm looking at the things that are a hop away. And I think that this type of assessment lets you see the areas that are the ones you should be looking at first right away.
Okay, I'm good now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the important part, is that you can identify the areas that are incredibly risky, and then they might be 10 hops away, but the fact that a breach on them would be substantial to your business means that you should address them first. Cool. I got 2 of these if anybody wants one. All right, thank you.